Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to my train room. I've enjoyed this recent series of home projects for my own layout, but as always, all good things have to come to an end. However, for this week's project, I'm still here at home. I'm just up in my office designing a layout for a customer. So let's head upstairs and take a look. This design is for an N-scale project. Let me just bring it up on the screen. I'm using Third Planet to draw it, which is the same software that I use for all my layout planning. You move it aside for the time being and bring up the specifications. Okay, the specs I was given were for Code 80 PECO flex track and insulfrog turnouts, turnout control using Walther servos, and an NCE DCC system with 3 power districts. The main room is around 24.5 feet by 12 foot 2, and then there's a 16 foot by 2.5 feet scenic section in an adjoining room. We'll be calling this the office section because it's in his company office. The features he wanted to include were as follows: an intermodal yard. He wants the largest yard that is practical, including at least one track for a 6-foot intermodal train and one for a 7-foot passenger train at the depot. He wants a New England wharf town. He wants a rural farm scene. He wants a Saturday night sprint car racetrack. He wants a small town scene. Originally I was thinking that the rural farm and the small town scene could be combined, but then doing the design I eventually found space to have both of them separately. He wants a seedy wrong side of the tracks town. He wants a New England autumn mountain scene. He wants an engine facility but no turntable. He specified no turntable. He wants a water scene in the canyon area with a lake, river and a series of whitewater rapids and a waterfall, detailed rugged rocky mountains, canyons, trestles, bridges, tall and steep mountains with snow on the highest peaks in the corners and sheer canyon walls. That is the scene that had to be in the office module drawn up here. I'll describe that later. He wanted 4 independent loops of main line running through this scene so that he could have trains running constantly during store hours. He wants a pair of reversing loops to turn trains around. He wants a minimum radius of 22 inches, except on the logging line, which he specified that can be down as low as 11-inch radius. He wants all his mainline grades no steeper than 2%. He needs clear access from this 34-inch wide door to the arch in the northeast corner, a minimum of 3 feet wide. This 28-inch door here sees only occasional use and can have a swing bridge or lift gate crossing it if necessary. And lastly, I was told that this intermediate wall is non-load bearing and can be pierced in as many places as we want to. So that's the specifications. Let's now get down to the design process. The first sketch I drew, I already had this main peninsula on the east side of the layout already roughed in, but I was trying to figure out if I had room for a turnback curve on a peninsula in the middle. The 2 large circles represent double track mainline curves with a 22-inch radius on the middle, and the smaller circles are a 30-inch diameter, which indicate my desired minimum width for operating aisles. And as we can see down here, it doesn't quite fit. I cannot get a blob here and another blob in here and still have a 30-inch aisle between them. So that shape didn't quite work. I then tried modifying it, moving the blob along the south wall to the other side of the 28-inch door, figuring that we could use a lift gate or hinge flap in this area. And then the problem was in this area here, because there really wasn't room. Keeping a minimum width of 2 feet, which is what I was going to need for a decent yard. Remember, he asked for the largest yard possible, and I felt that the longest straight wall was the best place of putting that. I didn't want to compromise either this benchwork width here or the width of the aisle in front of it, and I ended up with very little throat here for the double-sided peninsula area, also with another minimum width aisle here forming the edge of the layout. So I rejected that design as well. Now here the layout is starting to take its final shape. I drew this peninsula into scale. Then instead of a 30, I put a 36-inch aisle here because it's the main entry to the layout, and I figured people will be passing here quite frequently. We've got an uninterrupted long straight yard area, the aisle in front of it, coming around the end. And this plan now works with a turn back curve here. The benchwork along here is only 12 inches wide. And then when I figured how many main lines we're going to have to run through it, because remember he wants 4 mainline loops, and although one of them could be a shorter loop, I've now got a double track and single track main line running around the west and south sides of the room and back again. So that means 4 distinct main lines through this area, and I felt that the benchwork was too cramped here. Either I was going to have to leave most of it in tunnel, or it was really going to look like a spaghetti bowl, which I didn't like. So even though I felt this footprint was getting close, I had to reject it for that reason. So I'm now back in Third Planet, where I show the final benchwork footprint. I've now reduced the width of the center peninsula to 3 feet, which means I can no longer get a mainline turnback curve in here. My mainline circuits are still in excess of 100 feet, so I felt that the slight shortening of the mainline loops was acceptable, and it gave me an area for a stub-ended feature as well that wouldn't be compromised by having the main lines passing by in the background. By this time I'd already decided that the main yard was going to be on the top level and the loops were going to run around underneath it, and I figured if I could get enough vertical separation, there was room to put a small staging yard in here. Now, although staging is something that the customer didn't specifically ask for, I feel it's always desirable to put it in. It's not a large staging yard by any means. I've drawn it only 5 tracks wide because I'd already figured out that I can get about 8 inches of vertical clearance. And I didn't want to go with a wide staging yard with that amount of clearance. So I've drawn 5 tracks, and although normal track spacings for N scale are 1 1/8 inch, I drew these at 1.5 inches to allow for more finger room between the trains. I'm using the long radius PECO turnouts entirely, because the short ones have a diverging route which is slightly less than his desired minimum mainline radius. And especially with crossovers and such, the 36-inch radius of the long radius turnouts is going to track a lot better. At this stage I've drawn in all the track for the scenic section in the office, plotted where the river can go, and I've just left the curve sticking out of the end. I've put Ys at both ends of this lower level staging yard, so the short loop of the 4th main line now becomes a pair of interlaced return loops, allowing trains to be turned in either direction. If you recall, that was one of his requirements. I've now drawn in a few more of the mainline curves. Note that I still have these circles in the aisles, reminding me how wide all the aisles are relative to my 30-inch target. As we see from this door and around here, this is where he asked for a minimum of 36, and I've drawn it at 37. Around this side, up through the middle, and in front of the main yard, I've kept it at 36, then it drops to 30, and then down to 24, just for this little alcove here. And as I say, you're never going to need to pass people here anyway. There's a lot of spare bits of track stuck in the aisles. That's because if I draw something and I'm not quite sure that it's the best alignment, I combine it into a group, drag it into the aisle to save it for later, just in case I have to go back to it, and then I plot it again. And we can see that I had 3 attempts at getting this curved passing siding on the single track main line. I've drawn in all the tracks in this end showing where they can go, and I've decided that in this section here the lower back loop of the single track main will be hidden in tunnel and the other 3 will run through it. Let me delete these extra sections here. If you look where the mouse is now, I've dragged the full range of turnouts that I have to work with into the aisle, and then I've duplicated them so I've got left and right versions of each in all 4 orientations. So we've got the long and medium radius straight turnouts, we've got the Y and the curved turnout. I've also dragged the 2 sizes of crossing into the aisle as well, even though I ended up not using them in the plan. Here I've connected up the Ys at the end of the staging area, and I've worked on the 2 towns in the southern area of the plan. The 3-foot wide peninsula is a perfect location for the harbour town that he wanted, with the wharf, and although he didn't ask for it, I found space for a car float, which is often very desirable in a waterfront scene. And that I've connected up with a short branch line from this passing siding. The passing track here is put in mainly because if the harbour local arrives with too many cars, some of them can be left in this passing siding to avoid congestion down below. And then on the high level double track main line, I've put in a small town here with 3 spurs. This is going to be like the farming scene, and there's room for grain elevators, a rural team track and freight house. And as I said earlier, at this point I was thinking that this would also double as the small town scene, although I found a good location for that elsewhere. I haven't started working on the main yard yet because I was still waiting for some more information. Also in this version you see that I've now put in the size he gave me for the oval racetrack, because I have to find somewhere for that. Now I've plotted most of the trackage in the main yard. I've got a through yard 6 tracks wide, and then behind it I've got another 3-track interchange yard, because as there was going to be 2 routes going through this area, I designed it in such a way that the double track main line and the single track main behind it look as though they were built by different companies, and they both built side by side yards for easy interchange. I've also got a single long passing track in front of the main line, and that is going to be his Amtrak station with the required storage track to get his long passenger train off the main line. This triangular area here has been earmarked for the engine terminal, and I had to make a compromise. These 3 long tracks down here are going to be the intermodal yard. Now I know most intermodal yards are run through, but if I was going to do that, then it would have to go here where the main yard was going to be, and then I wouldn't have enough space for a decent sized main yard. Or if I move them to the other end of the room, I was going to have to encroach into what I'd earmarked for the New England Fall Mountain area, and I was going to end up with very little open running. I did consider running the tracks off the end of the benchwork here, so at least aesthetically it looks as though it could continue, even though operationally you'd still have to back trains in. Thinking back to the last layout specifications I was given that called for an intermodal yard, I went to the trouble of giving it prime position for 3 nice long double-ended tracks in front of the main yard, and the layout design that was selected by the customer over mine had a very tiny cramped single-ended intermodal yard, so I figured maybe it didn't make any difference. Okay, moving on, I have now finished drawing in the engine terminal. If you recall, he specifically said no turntables. I put in the Walters double track engine house It was later replaced with the 3-track version, and also beside it there's the 3-track back shop, which he also wanted. I've allowed a fuel delivery track between them, and I've drawn in a few industrial spurs. I've also plotted in where the oval racetrack might go, although I did eventually move it. Now I've started to lay out the fall scene down here. I drew a river running through it, crossed twice by the double track, while the single track remains hugging the rear bank for maximum interest. Here I've drawn in most of the structures. I've also changed the alignment here. I angled the main line back significantly, allowing room to put the racetrack in front of it. That way I don't have to allow the full area, as it can fall off front edge of the benchwork. Since it's a dummy racetrack, he's not actually going to have slot cars running around it. That allows me plenty of room for the grandstand and the pit buildings, which are a lot more interesting than the spectators' parking lots, which would now be off stage. I've put in all the structures for the farming town, and then I've drawn the small town over here. I cut and pasted all the buildings from the rough sketch that he gave me, just rearranged them slightly. Most of the structures in this end form a double-sided backdrop, so that it's not obvious that the main wraps around a 180-degree curve and then folds back on itself. And then in this corner, just before the double track main line disappears from the scene, is his wrong side of the tracks town that he asked for. This rectangle here represents the size of the N-scale Walters City Station, just as a placeholder, even though we're not actually expecting to put it here, just in case he also wants to run passenger trains on the single track main line. Remember, we have staging on this loop so that he can hide it out of the way. And he didn't want a lot of staging, so I didn't put a second staging yard on the double track. The layout was already becoming complex enough, and I didn't want to overcomplicate it by adding an extra staging yard that he didn't ask for in the first place. All that remains to do now is to draw in the scenic features to make the plan look beautiful. Because the way the plan is presented, it's effectively a sales brochure, because we're trying to get him to commission us to build the layout. So here is the finished plan. As you can see, I've put my name on it, and I've given annotations to the various scenes, because I will need that when I do the written description of the layout. I've drawn in the green belt here with the small rural town, which is actually in the shadow of a much larger town, which is okay. Many rural towns are close by bigger towns, and there's still enough green belt between them that it's not going to look cramped. And then with the structures here, the road is at a higher elevation than the railroad track. So on this side, these would be 4-story buildings. On the back side, there would only be 2-story buildings. Depending on which side you view them from, they appear to be 2 different structures in different towns. So the main line comes out of a tunnel, around a curve, under a bridge, through the wrong side of the tracks town, past the oval racetrack, through green belt, through the small town scene, past the intermodal yard, past the industrial park on the other side of the track, the engine terminal, into the main yard. Exiting the other end, we have a single industrial spur serving a team track and a propane dealer. We twist and turn through open scenery, across a river, and then back across it a second time. Such double river crossings were fairly common on the prototype when a river had to make a sharp bend that the railroad couldn't follow properly. It would just cut the corner. So after winding through the fall scenery for a considerable distance, we cross the throat of this centre peninsula and arrive in a rural farming town. Here all the tracks are on the same main line, trailing point for easy switching. There is no connection to the other main line at all, because it doesn't need to be. And I've drawn where a freight and passenger depot might still be standing, even though by the period model they're probably abandoned. Then we dive into a tunnel and we head back through all the open area again, but near the back of the benchwork where the main line can be hidden between two tree lines and it won't draw attention to itself unless there's actually a train on it. That will allow for better viewing of the other main lines most of the time and avoid the area looking like a spaghetti bowl. Remember, the two visible tracks that run through it were built by different railroad companies, so it is a reasonably logical arrangement, even though by the period in question there's a good chance they will both have been swallowed up by the same regional giant. And then the double track main line passes through the office scene as a high level line in the background. The whole of the double track section is level at 8 inches above datum, which allows for some pretty tall mountains, which is what he called for. Now for the single track, in order to rise 6 inches, I needed a single turn helix under the peninsula. Well, actually it's more 1.5 turns because it's directly under the end curve, slightly inside this one, again on a 22-inch radius curve. It enters the visible portion on a rising grade, skirting round the back of the industrial park and the engine terminal in front of a continuous row of city buildings before entering its own yard. Now, the engine terminal has been set up so that it has good access to either loop. So it's a shared engine terminal. It saves a lot of space having to put in two of them. Exiting the yard, we have another industry he wanted. I forget what it's called, but that's the footprint of the industry that he wanted to incorporate. Past the propane dealer, the grade starts to fall, follows the opposite bank of the river all the way around. A slight broad curve here underneath the double track main line. Through most of the river scene, the track is actually level since I had a lot more length than I needed to drop the 8 inches to the staging yard. So this is a great opportunity for photographing trains, for eye level views, shooting across the water to the railroad beyond. And you'll see there's only one river bank here, so that the far bank doesn't get in the way of those pictures. Around the end of this track here, we have a short branch line to the harbour scene. I haven't put all the structures in here because I don't really know what he wants. I've just left plenty of room for them, as I did with some of the industrial spurs in the main yard. Now this road on a falling grade from the rural town passes under the double track and over the single track main line, so it visually separates the junction a little bit more, even though it's only a few feet. And by keeping the grade at 2%, I was able to gain about 3/4 of an inch separation between the wharf trackage and this section of the line that it leads in from. Just enough to be interesting. And then immediately after this junction, it disappears for a considerable distance before reappearing in the other room. If you recall from an earlier picture, we see that the two single track loops are side by side at this point, giving the appearance of double track, although it then visibly divides at the other end into two singles. So this is now a junction area. I've got a pair of crossovers. Those are vital to allow the short loop to double as return loops for the main line. Here's the logging branch that he asked for. Leaves the loop just after the bridge, winds its way up on a 2% grade before disappearing under the high level main line. Now it's difficult to justify a tunnel on a logging branch, but this is just one of the compromises that we have to make on a model. There was no other way of having it disappear. This area can be densely buried in trees to obscure it as much as possible and make it less obvious. It then reappears here where it's behind the upper track main line and it's a lot better disguised at this end. We reach the top of the grade about here, 4 inches up, so halfway between the low level track and the high level. And then we have a small yard here for a logging camp. Here's a small timber trestle that he asked for and 2 more double track bridges on the main line. Off the front loop I have a passing siding and I've tied in the coal mine to the middle of that siding with a short branch line. It can be on a falling gradient to about -1/2 inch, giving us just enough grade separation here to be interesting. And this track also serves as a lead, so the mine can be switched without interfering with mainline trains. Now, very late in the design process, in fact it was after all the track had been finalized and I was already adding the scenery items, I got a call from the customer asking if it was possible to run a track around the south and east walls of the room, gaining access into the other room to fill that too with layout at a later date. And by pure chance, the layout design allowed for it. If you recall, the single track main line runs from the staging yard around here hidden, so I could just cut a turnout into this curve, 2 lift bridges across these 2 doors, and a narrow shelf around here. Now, this is a lot of track to remain unscenic and possibly a wasted opportunity. So I recommended to the customer, if he really did think he would extend it eventually, to cut about a 3-foot section out of the main yard and move the whole of the east peninsula 3 inches to the left. This aisle will still be 33 inches wide, which is wide enough, and that will allow for a narrow scenic section along here, possibly even a passing track and a spur or two, to make another switching town. So that just about wraps up the design process. I hope you got something out of it, and I will report back at some point in the future with any progress. Well, that's all I have to say about that layout. I did give the customer a detailed written description when I sent him off the plan, some of which I will summarise down below. If you'd like more information about this design, feel free to comment below. And remember, I offer a custom track planning service through my website, superiormodelrailroads.com. I'll put a link to that below. That's all for this week. I hope to see you again next time. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.